Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Faculty Fellow Spotlight here at the Pulte Institute for Global Development. I'm here today with Professor Marc Muller. Marc, how are you doing today?
Great, thanks so much for having me.
So, as a part of the Pulte Institute's Faculty Fellow Friday series, we'd like to ask you a few questions. Are you up for it?
Absolutely.
All right, here we go. Well, first things first, can you please introduce yourself for us?
Sure. My name is Marc Muller. I'm an assistant professor here in the College of Engineering, and I'm affiliated with the Pulte Institute. My key area of expertise is water resources. So I'm a hydrologist, and particularly the interaction between water and human behavior. So topically, I'm very interested in situations where either conflict or cooperation arises over water or food security. And from a methodological standpoint, I develop mathematical models, and I use satellite imagery and statistical models to determine what causes what in places where you can't easily get data.
Thank you. Yeah, and adding on to that, what's one thing you think students or others here at Notre Dame might be surprised to find out about you?
So I actually grew up in a ski resort. So I'm from Switzerland, so I grew up in a ski resort in the Swiss Alps. And it's interesting because I teach Lynn Ostrom during my class. And so she wrote, of course, about governing common pool resources. And so I always use my village as an example. I'm actually going to share a picture of it right here. And so, like one of the traditional commons that she looked at was actually Swiss pastures. And you could really see in the village, the lower commons and the upper commons, and how the cows were managed there. And so I always use this example when I teach my class, and students are surprised. You come from there. This is where you grew up, and I'm like, yeah. So I was very fortunate.
Wow. Yes, I'm sure. Yeah, it looked just like South Bend, right? So an easy transition.
Yeah.
So one thing we want to do is to get to know a bit more, like we said already, about you as a person, but also about the things that have inspired you and brought you to the work you do now. So what would you say are some readings that inspire you or have influenced your work?
So I have a bunch. I'm not going to talk about all the readings that influenced my work, because otherwise we'll be here forever. But if I should focus on two of them, so Ostrom, of course. So she wrote about governing common pool resources. And I really like her work because she busted the myth of tragedies of the commons, how we are stuck in using shared resources because we can't get ourselves out of overusing them. And her argument was very simple. If we are really into this cycle of overusing resources, there shouldn't be any resources left to begin with, right? So we must be doing something right. And so she took the humble perspective of looking at traditional commons, how are people traditionally managing those resources. And she looked at, forests in Japan, pastures in Switzerland, etc. And she came up with those commonalities that these very different ways of managing the commons have. Out of these commonalities, she came up with a bunch of design principles, and no wonder she got a Nobel Prize for it. So this is very inspiring work. Another author that I really like is also a Nobel Prize winner. His name is Amartya Sen, famous economist, and his most famous book, I think, is Poverty and Famines. And he showed with this book that modern famine do not come up because there's no food, but simply because we're not able to distribute it in a way that's fair and effective. And so I think that's kind of a thought revolution here, right? Because you think about famines as there not being enough food for everybody, and he showed that no, it's actually an economic and a societal problem. And he really added this human dimension to food security that I think is critical. Another book that I like from him that's a little bit less well known, is called Identity and Violence. And I think this is a very important book because he makes the argument that oftentimes conflicts and violence oftentimes arises from this erroneous perspective that we have, that we only have one identity. So I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian, and so therefore, we're one against the other. But he makes the argument that in reality, we have many, many different identities, right? I'm a man, I'm a Christian, I'm from Switzerland, etc., right? And all these parallel identities are so diverse that there's always a way to find some common ground to actually not fight. And so if we were more conscious about our diverse identity, there would be less violence. And I thought that was a very good and simple lesson.
So coming from Switzerland originally. What languages do you speak? Are there any others?
So yeah, my mother tongue is French. So oui, je parle français. I was born, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. If you grew up in Switzerland, you have to learn another national language. So there are 4 national languages in Switzerland: French, Swiss German, Italian, and a very beautiful language called Romansh, which only about 10,000 people speak, but it's very pretty. So I ended up learning German, and my wife, as a matter of fact, is from the Swiss German part of Switzerland, so I also understand Swiss German. I cannot speak it, but I understand it.
Very cool. So one of the blessings of being involved in the kind of work that we do is that you often get to travel for work. And so I know you've done that. You've also traveled, of course, yourself. What is the most amazing place that you've been to, or the place that you consider the most amazing on Earth?
So that's gonna sound corny, but I'd say home. So the place I grew up in is actually, the place I'd like to return, and going there. Nothing beats just sitting in the mountains and taking it in, right? But that being said, I've been fortunate to travel quite a bit, as you said, over the last 10 to 20 years. And I'd say, different countries or different places are my favorite for different reasons. So I spent a lot of time in Tanzania doing the Swiss equivalent of a Peace Corps. And I'd say Tanzania has it all from a natural wonder perspective, right? You could do safari, you could go on Kilimanjaro, you could do beautiful beaches, great cuisine. So yeah, it's a beautiful. If I were to go on a honeymoon again, I would go to Tanzania probably. When it comes to food, Vietnam is definitely my favorite. When it comes to attitude, I'd say Cambodia. Like, people are really laid back there, and I really just enjoy spending time in Cambodia. And then I did much of my PhD was focusing on Nepal, and so like for the sheer awe of nature, I'd say Nepal is pretty high up there. I grew up in Switzerland, but I've never seen steep places as I've seen in Nepal. So.
Wow, yeah, that's an interesting perspective too. So talking about this travel aspect, that that's a big part of development work in many ways, but it's not the reason that people usually get into it. So how did you first get involved in global development work? What work have you done with our team here at the Pulte Institute?
Sure. Yeah. So when I was an undergrad, after the end of my freshman year, I went to Southeast Asia just for the summer to travel. My uncle actually lives there. So my mom was born in Cambodia, so I have like origins in Southeast Asia, and so I went for the first time to visit. And so my uncle was living in Vietnam, and we went together to Cambodia just to visit the place. He was born and my mom was born. And so I needed a visa, both to go to Vietnam and to go to Cambodia. My uncle needed a visa to go to Cambodia, so we both got visas. We visited Cambodia, it was beautiful. But then on the way back, he crossed the border into Vietnam. I wanted to cross, but my Vietnamese visa was erroneously stamped, so it wasn't valid anymore. And back then you couldn't get visas at the border. So I was 19 years old and stuck in Cambodia, and my uncle couldn't come back because his visa in Cambodia was already, stamped. And so all he had the chance to do was hand me $20 and just a phone number and tell me, okay, go back to Phnom Penh, the capital city, and just give a phone call to this guy. I know him. And so I was freaking out, of course. So I took my $20, paid the taxi to go back to Phnom Penh, and then gave this guy a call. And it turns out that this guy was a missionary that was doing community development. So he is still an environmental engineer that was helping villagers kind of identify their own needs and developing like agriculture and stuff like that. And so I spent a bit of time with him, and this is really what got me started into being excited about this work, and the rest is history. So with regards to the Pulte Institute, so the minute I arrived at Notre Dame, actually even before I arrived in Notre Dame, I got this email randomly saying, okay, would you be interested in going in Bangladesh? I was like, sure, I've never been to Bangladesh. And so I went to Bangladesh, and Michael Swiker was a part of the trip. And the idea was to create research links with institutions in Bangladesh. So we spent a lot of time, Michael and I just chatting about development. And so that's how I got, I knew about Pulte. And then I also spent time with Tom Purikal in Israel for another workshop. But the way I was actually involved in terms of working with Pulte, I was writing a grant on water and conflicts, and part of the grant was about looking at the Syrian conflict and the role water might have played there. And I needed somebody on the ground in Syria to do some field work. And of course, it was the height of the Syrian conflict, so I had absolutely no hope of finding anybody. But I sent email out to people in Notre Dame to see if anybody knew anybody. And I get this email from Tom saying, yeah, I know this guy in Daraa in southern Syria. So Daraa is the epicenter of the Syrian conflict. It's where it all started. And he knew this guy in Daraa that was affiliated with some research institute there that was able to do some research. So I was like, yeah, Pulte actually has really broad connections. And, that's how I started to get engaged. These days, I'm mostly active on a project about water and human rights. So the idea is to look at water extractive industries and see, how their impact on water availability and water governance might relate to violations or not of human rights. So it's a very interesting project.
Great, thank you. So what work or research have you done, with us or otherwise, that you feel most passionate about?
So this project on water and human rights, actually, I really feel passionate about. Like from a day-to-day basis, it's sometimes challenging, but really, if you take a step back and look at the perspective, I think making an explicit connection between water challenges on the ground and legal concept associated with human rights actually could have a big impact, right? It could really make a change in terms of allowing people and corporations to make the right decisions. So I'm really excited about this project. I'm excited about other stuff that I'm working on. So I have, for example, this rather large research project on land grabbing, so large-scale land acquisitions. It's multinational companies that buy lands in developing countries to plant crop and do commercial agriculture. So we've been using satellite imagery to look at what impact this practice has on local food security, on water competitions, on deforestation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very interesting project as well. Otherwise, I have another project on groundwater cooperation. So whenever two countries share a river, they typically have an agreement. There's often a treaty. All rivers that are shared between countries have treaties almost. But there's almost no treaty on shared groundwater. And so the project is about asking why the treaties on groundwater that do exist were able to come about. So that's also a very cool project. And finally, the last project I will mention is my work on water and conflicts. So we look at, there's a lot of talk about climate change and how that may affect, the emergence of armed conflicts. But an element that's oftentimes, almost always, between climate change and armed conflict is water, right? So climate affects water, who may or may not affect conflict. And so this connection, it's something that I'm really excited about.
Thank you for sharing. So to kind of start closing up here, we wanted to ask then, for people who are interested in this kind of work, what advice would you give to them, especially to students who want to make a difference in the world through what they do?
Yeah, so from my perspective, so what made a difference in my decision to kind of get involved was to actually get out there, right? So travel, just don't hesitate to actually see the world and be involved anywhere you can. And when I was a 19-year-old and just looking at stuff, I didn't make a huge difference back then. But I think, and it's likely that if you're a student and you're 19, you're probably not going to make a huge difference, at the moment. But having this experience will actually change your life, and this will make a difference, right? Both, of course, for your own life, but also the people you will interact with, and eventually you will. It is changing yourself. It sounds corny, but changing yourself is a first step to change the world, I guess. The other thing that I would mention is cultivate your faith, right? So the world is broken. There's a lot of reason to despair. And also, if you look at your own life, oftentimes, it doesn't go in the direction that you hoped it was going to go, and it's complicated. There's a lot of setbacks and stuff. And so in all of this, it's very important to kind of be able to take a step back and keep perspective, and source your strength and your hope at the right place, I guess. In that direction, the holistic kind of education that you get at Notre Dame is really very valuable, and not all places are able to do that. So I'm very fortunate to be here.
Wonderful, thank you. So to close, last question, where can we learn more about your work and any recent publications that you've been working on?
Sure, so I maintain a personal research website, so you could go online. It's Muller Water Group, so MULLERWATER group.weebly.com, and everything should be up to date there. And my email is also up there, so don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thank you, Marc, again for joining us for this Faculty Fellow Spotlight, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.